Dr. Patricia Williams's gloved hands froze mid-motion as the scalpel exposed what lay beneath Robert Mitchell's weathered skin. The entire operating room fell silent except for the steady beep of monitors. What should have been routine, fatty tissue removal had just become something she'd never encountered in 15 years of head and neck surgery. "Jesus Christ," whispered the surgical resident beside her, stepping back instinctively. The mass that 74-year-old Robert had hidden beneath carefully arranged scarves for 28 years had finally yielded its secret. Embedded deep within the inflamed tissue, something metallic caught the harsh surgical lights, something that had no business being there, something impossible. "Get pathology down here now," Dr. Williams ordered, her voice steady despite the shock coursing through her. The nurse's hand trembled as she reached for the phone. Inside the growth, partially encased in the body's own protective tissue, lay a piece of military history that would shatter everything Robert Mitchell believed about the worst day of his life. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Robert "Bobby" Mitchell had always been a man of few words, fewer complaints, and absolutely no tolerance for what he called medical nonsense. At 74, he still carried himself with the rigid posture of someone who'd learned discipline in the Georgia heat of basic training and perfected it in the unforgiving jungles of Vietnam. His weathered hands, scarred from decades of construction work, could still frame a house or wire a circuit breaker, but they trembled now when he thought no one was looking. The trembling had started 3 years ago, the day they'd buried Linda. His wife of 46 years had been the only person who could make him laugh, make him talk, make him feel like the man he'd been before the war, carved pieces out of his soul. She'd also been the only one who'd dared mention the growing lump on his neck, the one he'd hidden beneath carefully arranged collars and seasonal scarves since 1996. "Bobby, honey, that thing's getting bigger," Linda would say gently, her fingers tracing the air near his neck without quite touching. "Maybe we should have Dr. Peterson take a look." "It's nothing," he'd grunt, turning away from her concerned gaze. Just getting old. But it wasn't nothing, and they both knew it. What had started as a small, painless bump the size of a marble had grown over the decades into something roughly the size of a tennis ball, distorting the right side of his neck and forcing him to sleep upright in his recliner. The mass had become his shameful secret, a physical manifestation of all the words he couldn't say and all the help he refused to ask for. Jessica Mitchell Barnes, his 48-year-old daughter, possessed her mother's sharp intuition and her grandfather's stubborn streak. As an ER nurse at Atlanta General, she'd seen enough denial to recognize it in her own father, the way he held his head tilted slightly to the left, the way he'd switched to turtlenecks in Georgia summers, the way he'd stopped coming to family barbecues where people might stare. "Dad's not well," she'd told her daughter Sophia during one of their regular phone calls. "I'm worried about that mass on his neck. It's gotten so much bigger since Mom died." Sophia Barnes, 24 and in her final year of medical school, had inherited the family's protective instincts along with their medical curiosity. She'd been watching her grandfather retreat from life since her grandmother's funeral, watching him shrink into himself until he became almost invisible in his own home. The Mitchell family had always carried their burdens quietly, but some burdens, Sophia was beginning to understand, were too heavy for one person to bear alone. The intervention came on a humid Tuesday morning in September, orchestrated with the precision of a military operation. Sophia had driven down from Atlanta the night before, her medical textbooks stacked in the passenger seat alongside a folder of research she'd been compiling for months. Jessica had taken the day off from her nursing shift, something she rarely did, which should have been Robert's first warning that this wasn't a casual family visit. They found him on his back porch, coffee growing cold in his hands as he stared out at the overgrown garden Linda had once tended with such care. The morning mist clung to the Georgia pines like smoke from old battles, and for a moment Robert felt that familiar tightness in his chest, the one that came before the memories he spent most days successfully avoiding. "Morning, Dad?" Jessica's voice carried that particular tone he'd learned to recognize over the years. The same tone she'd used when she'd told him about her divorce, about Linda's cancer diagnosis, about all the conversations that changed everything. "Sophie." He nodded to his granddaughter without turning around. "Thought you had classes on Tuesdays." "I do," Sophia said, settling into the chair beside him with the confidence of someone who'd made up her mind about something difficult. "But some things are more important than anatomy lab." That's when Robert knew he was in trouble. Sophia had been passionate about medicine since she was 12 years old, when she'd watched Jessica work on a neighbor's child who'd fallen from his bicycle. For her to skip class meant this was serious, the kind of serious that made his neck throb with anticipatory dread. "We need to talk about your health, Grandpa." Sophia pulled out her phone, swiping to a photograph she'd taken the previous Sunday during their weekly family dinner. In the image, Robert sat in profile, his head tilted at an unnatural angle to accommodate the mass that had become impossible to hide. Robert stared at the screen, seeing himself as others must see him, an old man diminished by something he refused to acknowledge. When had the lump grown so large? When had he become so skilled at compensating for its presence that he'd stopped noticing how drastically he'd altered his life around it? "Jesus," he whispered, the word escaping before he could stop it. "It's gotten worse since Mom died, hasn't it?" Jessica moved to stand behind his chair, her nurse's training evident in how she assessed his posture, his breathing, the way he unconsciously favored his left side. "The pain? The difficulty sleeping? The weight loss? We've all noticed." Robert's hand moved instinctively to his collar, a gesture he'd perfected over decades of concealment. "It's just old age. Bodies break down." "That's what they do." "Grandpa, I'm in medical school." Sophia's voice was gentle but firm. "I know what I'm looking at, and this isn't normal aging. This is a significant mass that's affecting your quality of life and potentially your safety." The three of them sat in silence for a moment, listening to the morning sounds of suburban Georgia, lawn mowers in the distance, dogs barking, the everyday symphony of people going about their lives without carrying secrets embedded in their flesh. "I've made you an appointment," Jessica said finally, "with Dr. Patricia Williams at the medical center. She's a head and neck surgeon, one of the best in the state." "I didn't ask for an appointment." "No, but you need one." Sophia leaned forward, her expression serious. "Grandpa, this thing has been growing for almost 30 years. Whatever it is, it's not going away on its own." Robert felt trapped, cornered by the two women who loved him most in the world and who were determined to save him from himself. Part of him wanted to argue, to retreat into the stubborn silence that had protected him for so many years. But another part of him, the part that still woke up gasping from dreams of Vietnamese jungles and friends who'd never made it home, was tired of carrying burdens alone. What if it's cancer? The question came out smaller than he'd intended, revealing the fear he'd been nurturing alongside the growing mass. "Then we deal with it," Jessica said simply. "Together. Like we should have been doing all along. And if it's not cancer, then we figure out what it is and fix it if we can." Sophia reached over and took his weathered hand in her young, strong one. "But Grandpa, doing nothing isn't protecting you anymore. It's just postponing the inevitable while making you suffer unnecessarily." Robert looked at his granddaughter, this brilliant young woman who'd inherited Linda's compassion and his own stubborn determination, and realized she was right. The mass had become more than a physical burden. It had become a symbol of everything he couldn't face, couldn't fix, couldn't control. "When's the appointment?" "Thursday morning at 10, Jessica said, relief evident in her voice. "I'm driving you, and Sophie's meeting us there. I don't need a chauffeur." "Maybe not, but you're getting one anyway." Jessica's tone brooked no argument. "This is happening, Dad. We've waited long enough." Dr. Patricia Williams's office smelled of antiseptic and something Robert couldn't quite identify. Maybe fear, maybe hope. He'd spent 2 sleepless nights since the appointment was made, alternating between relief that he was finally addressing the problem and terror at what they might find. The examination room felt smaller than it should have, with Jessica sitting ramrod straight in the corner chair and Sophia perched on the edge of another seat, her medical student's notebook balanced on her knee. Robert sat on the examination table wearing a hospital gown that felt like surrender. "Mr. Mitchell, I need you to understand the seriousness of what we're dealing with here." Dr. Williams' voice carried the weight of someone who'd delivered difficult news many times before. She held up the CT scan films against the light box, pointing to a dark mass that seemed to engulf the right side of his neck. "This growth has become extensive. It's pressing against your carotid artery, your jugular vein, and it's very close to your spinal cord." Robert stared at the ghostly images of his own anatomy, seeing his secret made visible in stark black and white. The mass looked alien, predatory, like something that had taken residence in his body without permission. "How extensive?" Jessica's professional training kicked in, her voice steady despite the fear Robert could see in her eyes. "Based on the imaging, I'd estimate it weighs between 8 and 10 pounds. It's also unusual in its composition." Dr. Williams switched to another scan, this one showing bright white spots embedded within the dark tissue. "There appear to be foreign objects within the mass. Metal fragments, most likely. Mr. Mitchell, do you have any history of trauma to this area?" The room seemed to tilt sideways. Robert's mouth went dry as memories he'd spent decades suppressing came flooding back. The jungle heat. The sound of incoming mortar rounds. Michael Tex Rodriguez's voice calling out as the world exploded around them. "Vietnam," he said, the word barely audible. Dr. Williams nodded gravely. "That would explain it. Retained shrapnel isn't uncommon in veterans. What's unusual is how your body has responded over time. It's created what we call a foreign body granuloma, essentially a protective shell around the metal. But that shell has grown far beyond normal parameters." Sophia leaned forward, her medical curiosity overriding her personal concern. "What kind of timeline are we looking at for this level of growth?" "Decades. This has been developing for a very long time." Dr. Williams turned back to Robert. "Mr. Mitchell, why didn't you seek treatment sooner? This must have been causing you significant discomfort." Robert felt the weight of 3 sets of eyes on him, all waiting for an explanation he couldn't give. How could he tell them that the pain had seemed like penance, that suffering in silence felt like the price he owed for surviving when others hadn't? "I thought it would go away on its own," he lied. "Dad?" Jessica's voice cracked slightly. "This thing is the size of a softball. It didn't just appear overnight." Dr. Williams cleared her throat, drawing their attention back to the medical reality. "We need to discuss surgical options. This mass has to be removed, and it needs to happen soon." "How soon?" Robert asked. "I'd like to schedule you for surgery within the week. The pressure on your vascular structures is concerning, and there's also the matter of your airway. If this continues to grow—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood the implications. "What are the risks?" Sophia asked, her notebook forgotten as she gripped the arms of her chair. Dr. Williams was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. "This will be complex surgery. The mass has grown around critical structures, major blood vessels, nerves, potentially portions of your spine. There's a risk of stroke, paralysis, damage to your vocal cords. And given the size and location," she paused, "there's also a significant risk that you might not survive the operation." The words hit Robert like physical blows. He'd faced death before, in rice paddies and jungle clearings, but this felt different. This felt like a consequence of his own stubbornness, his own refusal to deal with problems he couldn't control. "What happens if I don't have the surgery?" he asked. "The mass will continue to grow. Eventually it will either cut off your airway or cause a stroke. Either way." Dr. Williams' expression softened with compassion. "Mr. Mitchell, without surgery, you have perhaps 6 months. With surgery, assuming everything goes well, you could have years." Jessica stood abruptly, walking to the window where she stood with her back to the room, her shoulders shaking slightly. Sophia reached over and took Robert's hand, her grip strong and warm. "When do we schedule it?" Robert asked, his decision made. "Monday morning. That gives us the weekend to run additional tests and prepare." Dr. Williams's tone became brisk, professional. "Mr. Mitchell, I want you to understand this won't be easy, but it's your best chance." As they left the medical complex, Robert felt like he was walking toward something that would change everything, carrying with him the weight of 55 years of secrets that were about to be carved from his flesh. The weekend before surgery stretched before Robert like an endless road through hostile territory. He'd survived 3 days in the jungle with a bullet in his leg once, but these 72 hours of waiting felt more dangerous than any combat he'd faced. The house seemed different now, charged with the knowledge that he might not return to it, that this might be his last weekend in the home he'd shared with Linda for 4 decades. Saturday morning found him sitting at Linda's vanity table, something he'd avoided since her funeral 3 years ago. Her perfume bottles still held faint traces of her scent, white shoulders, the only fragrance she'd worn since their wedding day. He opened the jewelry box with trembling fingers, looking for something he wasn't sure existed. Hidden beneath her pearl necklace and the earrings he'd given her for their 25th anniversary, he found an envelope with his name written in her careful script. "For Bobby, when you're ready to stop punishing yourself for surviving." His hands shook as he opened it, Linda's voice seeming to whisper from the pages. "My dearest Bobby, if you're reading this, it means you've finally decided to face whatever's been eating at you since Vietnam. I've watched you carry something heavy for 46 years, something you've never been able to share even with me. I know it has to do with your friend Michael, the one you've never talked about but whose name you call out in your sleep." Robert's throat constricted. Even in death, Linda knew him better than he knew himself. "I found him, Bobby, 3 years ago, when the doctor first mentioned your neck mass. I hired a private investigator and we found Michael Rodriguez in El Paso, Texas. He's alive, Bobby." He's been alive this whole time. The letter slipped from Robert's fingers, fluttering to the floor like a wounded bird. Tex was alive. For 55 years, he'd carried the crushing weight of believing he'd failed to save his best friend, and Tex was alive. "I wanted to tell you," Linda's letter continued as he retrieved it with shaking hands. "I wanted to arrange for you two to meet, but I was afraid you weren't ready. I was afraid it would break you completely before it healed you. I'm sorry for keeping this secret, but I loved you too much to watch you fall apart." The letter included a phone number and an address in El Paso. Michael T.S. Rodriguez, 1247 Desert View Drive. The man Robert had mourned for more than half his life was living in a ranch house in Texas, probably watching Saturday morning cartoons with his grandchildren. Robert stumbled to the kitchen phone and dialed with fingers that barely functioned. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before a woman's voice answered. "Rodriguez residence?" "I'm looking for Michael Rodriguez," Robert managed. "From Vietnam, 1969. The silence on the other end stretched so long, Robert wondered if the connection had been lost. "Who is this?" the woman asked, her voice suddenly careful. "Bobby Mitchell. I served with Mike in the 173rd Airborne. We were friends." He heard the woman's intake of breath, then the sound of the phone being set down and muffled voices in the background. When she returned, her voice was thick with emotion. "Mr. Mitchell, this is Maria Rodriguez, Mike's wife. Mike passed away 6 months ago. Pancreatic cancer." The kitchen floor seemed to drop away beneath Robert's feet. He gripped the counter to keep from falling, his vision blurring as the cruel mathematics of time revealed themselves. Linda had found Tex 3 years ago. Tex had died 6 months ago. If Robert had read this letter when Linda first wrote it, if he'd overcome his stubborn pride and fear, he could have had 3 years to reconnect with his friend. "He talked about you," Maria continued, her voice gentle. "All the time, especially near the end. He said you saved his life in Vietnam, carried him 4 miles through enemy territory. He said he never got to thank you properly." "I thought he died," Robert whispered. "I thought he died in my arms." "No, Mr. Mitchell. He lived. We were married 47 years, had 4 children, 8 grandchildren. He became a high school history teacher. He had a good life because of what you did that day." As Maria talked, painting a picture of the life Tex had lived, coaching Little League, teaching American history, volunteering at the VA hospital, Robert felt something fundamental shifting inside him. The guilt he'd carried like shrapnel in his soul began to transform into something else, a profound grief, not for Tex's imagined death in 1969, but for his actual death 6 months ago, and for all the years of friendship they'd lost to trauma and silence. "Mrs. Rodriguez, did he ever try to find me?" "Oh, honey, yes. For years. The VA helped him track down addresses, but the letters kept coming back. And then, about 3 years ago, he got a letter from a woman named Linda Mitchell. She said she was your wife." Robert closed his eyes, seeing Linda at her desk, writing letters she'd never told him about, building bridges he'd been too afraid to cross. "They corresponded until she passed away," Maria continued. "Linda sent him pictures of your family, told him about your construction business, about your granddaughter going to medical school. Mike was so proud of you, so grateful you'd found happiness. Would it be possible for me to visit sometime?" "After my surgery?" "Surgery?" Maria's voice sharpened with concern. "Are you all right?" Robert found himself telling this stranger about the mass on his neck, about the surgery scheduled for Monday, about the metal fragments embedded in tissue that had grown around them for decades. "My God," Maria breathed. Mike had the same thing, a growth on his shoulder where shrapnel had lodged. The doctor said it was some kind of inflammatory response, the body's way of trying to protect itself from foreign material. The parallel was too striking to be coincidental. Both men had carried pieces of that terrible day in their flesh, their bodies creating protective shells around trauma they couldn't process any other way. "Mr. Mitchell, Mike left something for you. He made me promise to find you and give it to you if anything happened to him. Can you come to El Paso? Can you come before your surgery?" Robert looked at the calendar on Linda's desk. Sunday. He could drive to Texas Sunday, spend the night, and fly back Monday morning for surgery. "I'll be there tomorrow evening," he said. After he hung up, Robert sat in Linda's chair, surrounded by the detritus of a life shared, photographs, love letters from their courtship, the small domestic artifacts that accumulate over 46 years of marriage. For the first time since her funeral, he didn't feel her absence as an ache, but as a presence, a warmth that seemed to emanate from the very walls of their home. She'd known. Somehow she'd known that he needed to understand the truth about Vietnam before he could face whatever was growing inside him. She'd known that healing the wound in his soul might be the key to healing the wound in his flesh. He called Jessica to tell her about the trip to Texas, expecting resistance, arguments about pre-surgical protocols and the dangers of travel. Instead, she was quiet for a long moment before saying, "Mom would have wanted you to go. She always said you needed to find your way back from that war. How did you know about the war? Dad, I'm not blind. I've been watching you fight ghosts for 48 years. Maybe it's time you finally won. As Robert packed a small bag for Texas, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Hope. Not just for surviving the surgery, but for understanding finally why he'd survived when others hadn't, and what that survival was supposed to mean. The mass on his neck throbbed as he moved, but for the first time it felt less like a burden and more like a cocoon, something that had protected him while he waited for the strength to emerge, transformed. Monday morning arrived with the cold precision of military efficiency. Robert had driven through the night from El Paso, his mind reeling from what Maria Rodriguez had given him, not just answers about Tex's life, but a small metal box containing letters Tex had written but never sent, photographs from their unit, and something that had made Robert's hands tremble. A piece of shrapnel identical to what the doctors had found in his neck scan. "We were both carrying pieces of that day," Maria had said, her weathered hands gentle as she'd placed the box in his lap. "Mike always said you saved his life. But Bobby, I think maybe you both saved each other." Now, at 5 a.m. in the pre-surgical ward, Robert felt the weight of that truth pressing against his chest as Jessica helped him into the hospital gown. The fabric smelled of industrial detergent and fear, a combination that transported him instantly back to field hospitals in Vietnam, where the smell of antiseptic could never quite mask the metallic scent of blood. "Dad, you're shaking." Jessica's voice cut through his memories, her nurse's training evident in the way she assessed his vital signs without seeming to. "Are you in pain?" Pain was too simple a word for what he was experiencing. The mass on his neck throbbed with increasing intensity, as if it knew its time was coming to an end. But beyond the physical discomfort was something else, a psychological reckoning 55 years in the making. "Just nervous," he said, which was both truth and understatement. Sophia arrived as they were completing the pre-surgical paperwork, her medical student badge hanging from a lanyard that made her look impossibly young. She carried a folder thick with research she'd been conducting since Thursday's appointment, her determination to understand every aspect of his condition both touching and terrifying. "I've been reading about foreign body granulomas in combat veterans," she said without preamble, settling into the chair beside his bed. "The inflammatory response can persist for decades, especially when there's psychological trauma associated with the initial injury." Robert looked at his granddaughter, this brilliant young woman who approached problems with the same methodical precision he'd once used to frame houses, and realized she understood something about his condition that he was only beginning to grasp himself. "You think it's connected," he said, "the war and this thing growing inside me. I think trauma finds a way to manifest in the body when we can't process it any other way." Sophia's voice carried a wisdom that seemed too mature for her 24 years. "Grandpa, what happened over there?" The question he'd avoided for 5 decades hung in the antiseptic air between them. Around him, the pre-surgical ward hummed with quiet activity, nurses checking charts, patients being wheeled to operating rooms, families saying what might be final goodbyes. "There was an ambush," Robert began, his voice barely audible. "March 15, 1969, near Firebase Delta. My unit was on patrol when the mortars started falling." The memories came flooding back with brutal clarity. The sound of incoming rounds, the way the jungle floor erupted in geysers of dirt and shrapnel, the moment when he'd realized Tex was down and bleeding. "I carried him 4 miles through enemy territory," Robert continued, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the hospital room walls. "He was so still, so pale. There was blood everywhere. I kept talking to him, telling him he was going to be okay, that we were almost to the landing zone." Jessica moved to stand beside his bed, her hand finding his shoulder. "Dad, You don't have to. Yes, I do. Robert's voice grew stronger, more determined. When we reached the aid station, the medic took one look at Tex and shook his head, said there was nothing they could do. I watched them tag him and move him to the pile with the other. He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the words that had haunted him for 55 years. But he didn't die, Grandpa. Sophia's voice was gentle but firm. Mrs. Rodriguez told you he lived. He survived because of what you did that day. The medic was wrong, Robert whispered, understanding finally penetrating the fog of trauma and guilt. Or maybe Tex was so close to death that even a medical professional couldn't tell the difference. But he held on. Somehow he held on. Doctor. Williams appeared in the doorway, her surgical scrubs crisp and professional. Mr. Mitchell, it's time. As they wheeled Robert toward the operating room, the fluorescent lights passing overhead like frames in an old film reel, he found himself thinking about the metal fragments embedded in his neck, pieces of the same explosion that had nearly killed Tex, pieces he'd been carrying unknowingly for decades. Dr. Williams, he called out as they approached the OR doors. The metal you're going to find in there, it's from Vietnam, from the day I thought I lost my best friend. She nodded, understanding more than just the medical implications. Mr. Mitchell, I want you to know that regardless of what we find, you're going to be okay. We're going to take good care of you. The operating room was blindingly bright, a sterile cathedral where life and death decisions were made with surgical precision. As the anesthesiologist prepared the IV, Robert felt consciousness beginning to slip away, but not before one final thought crystallized in his mind. He hadn't failed Tex. He hadn't let his friend die. The shrapnel embedded in his neck wasn't a punishment for survival. It was evidence of the lengths he'd gone to save another human being. His body had been carrying proof of his heroism all these years, wrapped in layers of guilt and shame that had prevented him from seeing the truth. As the anesthesia took hold, Robert Mitchell finally let go of the burden he'd carried for 55 years, trusting that when he woke up, if he woke up, it would be to a world where survival was a gift rather than a sentence, where carrying on was an honor rather than a punishment. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Jessica's face through the operating room window, her lips moving in what he knew was a prayer. Not for miracles or divine intervention, but for the simple grace of a father coming home to his family, finally and completely free. The monitors beeped steadily as Robert Mitchell disappeared into surgical sleep, carrying with him the weight of half a century's worth of misunderstood sacrifice, ready at last to have it lifted from his shoulders by skilled hands and the healing power of long-delayed truth. The surgery lasted 6 hours, and for the first 4, everything proceeded as Dr. Williams had hoped. The mass, despite its intimidating size, separated cleanly from surrounding tissue. Robert's vital signs remained stable as the surgical team carefully dissected decades of inflammatory growth from his neck, working with meticulous precision around the critical structures that kept him alive. Then, at hour 5, everything went wrong. His pressure's dropping, the anesthesiologist announced, his voice cutting through the operating room's focused silence. Blood pressure 60/30 and falling. Dr. Williams looked up from the surgical field, her gloved hands still deep in Robert's neck. I can see the source. There's active bleeding from the carotid. Suction, please. What had appeared to be routine inflammatory tissue had concealed something far more dangerous. The metal fragments embedded in Robert's neck had caused gradual erosion of his carotid artery wall over the decades. Now, with the protective tissue removed, the weakened vessel was failing catastrophically. Get vascular surgery down here now, Dr. Williams ordered, her voice steady despite the crisis unfolding before her. Blood was filling the surgical field faster than the suction could clear it, turning what should have been the final phase of the operation into a fight for Robert's life. In the surgical waiting room, Jessica sat with her head in her hands while Sophia paced the small space with restless energy. They'd been told the surgery would take 3 to 4 hours. It had now been 6, and the steady stream of updates from the surgical nurses had stopped completely an hour ago. "Something's wrong," Jessica said, voicing what they both knew. "They should have been done by now." Sophia stopped pacing and sank into the chair beside her mother. "He's strong, Mom. Grandpa survived worse than this." But even as she said the words, Sophia felt doubt creeping in. Robert had looked so fragile that morning, so much smaller than the giant of her childhood memories. The man who'd taught her to fish and fix bicycles, who'd built tree houses with his bare hands and never seemed to need anyone's help for anything, had become someone who needed help just to breathe properly. At 3:17 p.m., Dr. Williams finally emerged from the operating room, still in her surgical scrubs, her face drawn with exhaustion and something else, a gravity that made Jessica's nurses' training scream warnings. "How is he?" Jessica stood immediately, reading the doctor's expression with professional eyes that had seen this look before. "He's alive," Dr. Williams said, and the way she said it made clear that this had been in serious doubt. "But we ran into complications. The metal fragments had caused significant damage to his carotid artery. We had to perform emergency vascular repair." "What does that mean for his recovery?" Sophia asked, her medical knowledge providing context her mother's fear couldn't process. Dr. Williams gestured for them to sit, a signal that never preceded good news. "Mr. Mitchell suffered significant blood loss during the procedure. His brain was deprived of adequate oxygen for several minutes while we repaired the arterial damage. We won't know the full extent of any neurological impact until he wakes up." The words hit Jessica like physical blows. Brain damage. Stroke. The possibilities cascaded through her mind with brutal clarity. Her father surviving the surgery only to lose himself in the process. "He could be different when he wakes up," Dr. Williams continued gently. "There might be memory loss, speech difficulties, paralysis. We simply don't know yet." "But he will wake up?" Jessica's voice was barely a whisper. "He's stable now. The next 24 hours are critical." As Dr. Williams left to check on her patient, Jessica and Sophia sat in the waiting room, surrounded by the debris of a day that had started with hope and ended with the terrible mathematics of medical crisis. The surgery that was supposed to free Robert from decades of physical burden might have cost him everything that made him who he was. "I should call his friends from the VA," Jessica said, her voice mechanical. "They'll want to know." "Mom." Sophia took her mother's hands, stilling the restless movement that betrayed her panic. "Remember what Grandpa always used to say? Don't borrow trouble from tomorrow, when today's got plenty of its own." But as they settled in for what would be the longest night of their lives, both women understood that some troubles couldn't be postponed indefinitely. Sometimes they came calling whether you were ready or not, demanding payment for years of silence, for surgeries delayed too long, for conversations that should have happened decades ago. Robert Mitchell lay unconscious in the intensive care unit, machines breathing for him while his brain fought to remember how to be Robert Mitchell. The mask that had defined him for 28 years was gone. But the man who remained was still an unknown quantity, a story whose ending hadn't yet been written. Robert woke up on Wednesday morning to the sound of Jessica crying. It wasn't the quiet, controlled weeping of someone trying to maintain dignity in a hospital setting. It was the raw, exhausted sobbing of someone who'd been keeping vigil for 48 hours. Someone who'd watched machines breathe for her father while wondering if the man she'd known her entire life would ever come back. "Hey!" Robert's voice came out as a hoarse whisper, barely audible above the steady beeping of monitors. "Why the waterworks?" Jessica's head snapped up from where it had been resting on the edge of his bed. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, her hair disheveled from days of running her hands through it during sleepless nights in uncomfortable hospital chairs. "Dad?" She leaned forward, studying his face with the intensity of someone afraid to hope. "Do you know where you are?" Robert tried to turn his head and immediately regretted it. Pain shot through his neck, not the familiar, dull ache of the mass he'd carried for decades, but the sharp, clean pain of surgical incisions healing. "Hospital," he managed. "The surgery. Did it work?" "Oh, God, yes." Jessica's voice broke as relief flooded through her. "Dad, you've been unconscious for 2 days. We thought... The doctors said there might be brain damage from the blood loss." As Robert's vision cleared and the fog of anesthesia lifted, he became aware of other presences in the room. Sophia sat in the corner, medical textbooks scattered around her feet, her usually neat appearance rumpled from sleeping in chairs. Dr. Williams stood at the foot of the bed, her expression cautiously optimistic. "Mr. Mitchell, I need to ask you some questions to assess your neurological function," Dr. Williams said, approaching with the careful movements of someone who'd delivered too much bad news over the years. "Can you tell me your full name?" "Robert James Mitchell." The words came easily, automatically. "What year is it?" 2024. "Do you remember why you're here?" Robert's hand moved instinctively toward his neck, where layers of bandages covered the surgical site. "The mass. You removed the mass." He paused, memories surfacing like bubbles in still water. "There were metal fragments. From Vietnam." Dr. Williams nodded, making notes on his chart. "Your cognitive function appears intact. The surgery was successful. We removed the entire growth along with several pieces of embedded shrapnel. The pathology report showed chronic inflammatory tissue consistent with a long-term foreign body reaction." "What about the complications?" Robert asked, noting the careful way everyone was watching him, the relief that seemed too intense for routine surgical success. "You nearly died on the table, Dad." Jessica's voice was steady now, but Robert could hear the echoes of fear beneath her professional composure. "The metal fragments had eroded your carotid artery. You lost a lot of blood while Dr. Williams repaired the damage." The magnitude of what had happened settled over Robert like a weight. He'd survived Vietnam, decades of carrying trauma in his body, and now this, a surgery that had brought him closer to death than he'd been since that jungle clearing in 1969. "But I'm okay now?" he asked. "You're more than okay," Sophia said, moving to stand beside Jessica. "Grandpa, you have no idea how different you look." For the first time since waking up, Robert really focused on his granddaughter's face. There was something in her expression, not just relief, but wonder, as if she was seeing something she'd never seen before. "Different how?" Jessica reached into her purse and pulled out a small mirror, holding it up so Robert could see his reflection. The man looking back at him was a stranger, not because of the surgical bandages or the hospital setting, but because of something more fundamental. His shoulders, which had been permanently hunched and twisted to accommodate the mass, now sat level and straight. His head, which had tilted at an unnatural angle for decades, now turned freely from side to side. But it was more than just the physical changes. The face in the mirror looked younger somehow, as if the removal of the mass had lifted years of weariness along with pounds of inflamed tissue. "My God," Robert whispered, raising his hand to touch his own reflection. "How long was I carrying that thing?" "According to the pathology report, probably close to 30 years, Dr. Williams said. Your body created an elaborate protective response around the metal fragments. Over time, that response became more problematic than the original injury." Robert stared at his reflection, trying to reconcile this stranger with the man who'd spent decades hiding behind scarves and high collars. "I feel lighter." "You are," Lighter, Sophia said, consulting her notes. The mass weighed almost 12 pounds. But, Grandpa, I think there's something else you need to see. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, clear container. Inside, suspended in preservative solution, were 3 pieces of twisted metal, each about the size of a coin. "This is what was embedded in your neck," she said, holding the container up to the light. "The largest piece has markings on it, numbers." Robert took the container with shaking hands, peering at the largest fragment through the clear plastic. Etched into the metal, barely visible but unmistakably there, were numbers: 3, 15, 69. "March 15th, 1969, he said, his voice barely audible. "The day of the ambush. The day you saved Michael Rodriguez's life," Sophia added gently. "Grandpa, Maria Rodriguez called while you were in surgery. She wanted to make sure you knew something. Tex carried an identical piece of shrapnel his whole life. From the same explosion. You were both wounded that day, both carrying pieces of the same moment." The implications of this revelation washed over Robert in waves. He and Tex had been connected not just by friendship and shared trauma, but by literal fragments of the same devastating moment. They'd both survived. Both carried physical reminders embedded in their flesh. Both lived with the psychological weight of that day. "She said Tex always wondered if you were okay," Jessica added. "He tried to find you for years through the VA. He wanted you to know that you didn't fail him, that what you did that day saved his life." Robert closed his eyes, feeling something fundamental shifting inside him, not just physically but emotionally. For 55 years he'd carried guilt along with shrapnel, believing he'd failed to save his friend. Now, with the metal fragments removed and the truth finally revealed, he could feel that guilt beginning to dissolve like morning mist. "There's something else," Sophia said, her voice gentle. "Mrs. Rodriguez is flying here from El Paso. She'll be here this afternoon. She's bringing something Tex left for you. Something he wanted you to have if you ever found each other again." "He's gone," Robert said, the reality hitting him anew. "I spent all these years carrying guilt over his death, and now I find out he lived a full life and died just months before I learned the truth." "But Grandpa," Sophia leaned forward, her young face serious with the weight of understanding, "don't you see? The timing isn't cruel, it's perfect. You couldn't have handled this truth while you were still carrying all that infected tissue, all that physical manifestation of trauma. You had to heal the wound in your body before you could heal the wound in your soul." As Robert lay in that hospital bed, surrounded by family and evidence of his own survival, he began to understand that some stories don't end the way we expect them to. Sometimes healing comes not from getting what we think we want, but from releasing what we've been holding on to too tightly. The mass was gone. The metal fragments that had defined his physical and emotional landscape for 3 decades had been removed. And for the first time since March 15, 1969, Robert Mitchell felt truly free. But the biggest revelation was still to come. Maria Rodriguez arrived at the hospital that Thursday afternoon carrying a worn leather satchel and the weight of 55 years of unfinished business. She was a small woman in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that held the particular combination of strength and gentleness that comes from loving someone through decades of nightmares and flashbacks. Robert was sitting up in bed when she entered, his neck still heavily bandaged, but his posture already noticeably different. The hunched, protective positioning that had defined him for decades was gone, replaced by the straight-backed bearing of the young soldier he'd once been. "You must be Bobby," Maria said, her voice carrying the slight accent of someone who'd grown up speaking Spanish before English. "Mike described you perfectly. Said you had honest eyes and stubborn shoulders. Mrs. Rodriguez." Robert tried to sit up straighter, the ingrained courtesy of his generation asserting itself despite the hospital setting. "Thank you for coming. I'm sorry about Tex. I wish I'd known sooner." Maria moved to the chair beside his bed, settling the leather satchel in her lap with the careful reverence reserved for sacred objects. Mike always said timing was everything in war and in life. Maybe this is the right time after all. Jessica and Sophia had stepped out to give them privacy, understanding instinctively that this conversation belonged to the generation that had paid for it in blood and silence. The hospital room felt suspended in time, a place where past and present could finally meet without the interference of decades of misunderstanding. "I brought you something," Maria said, opening the satchel. "Mike made me promise to find you and give you this if anything happened to him." She withdrew a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling. "He carved this himself during his recovery at Walter Reed. Took him almost a year to finish, working with hands that shook from nerve damage." Robert accepted the box with trembling fingers, noting the intricate detail of the carving, jungle scenes interwoven with symbols he recognized from their unit insignia. On the lid, burned into the wood with careful precision, were two names, Bobby Mitchell and Tex Rodriguez, separated by the dates 3/15/69 and Brothers in Arms. Inside the box, nestled in faded green felt, was a Purple Heart medal and a folded piece of paper. The medal wasn't Tex's. Robert could see his friend's name wasn't engraved on it. Instead, the engraving read, "Robert J. Mitchell, for wounds received in action, March 15, 1969. "I don't understand," Robert said, his voice barely audible. "I never received a Purple Heart." Maria's expression softened with understanding. "The paperwork got lost in the chaos after the ambush. You were evacuated to a different hospital than Mike, and somehow the records never caught up with you. When Mike recovered enough to ask questions, he found out what had happened. He petitioned the Army for years to get you the recognition you deserved." Robert stared at the medal, feeling the weight of official acknowledgement for wounds both visible and hidden. "He did this for me?" "He said you saved his life and never got credit for your own sacrifice. The medal finally came through about 5 years ago. Mike kept it safe, waiting for the day he could place it in your hands himself." With shaking fingers, Robert unfolded the paper. It was a letter written in Tex's careful script, dated just 6 months ago. "Bobby, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and Maria found you like I asked her to. I hope you can forgive an old man for keeping secrets. But I needed you to know the truth about March 15, 1969. You didn't fail me that day, brother. You carried me 4 miles through enemy territory with shrapnel in your own neck, never stopping, never giving up. The medics at the aid station thought I was gone. Hell, I thought I was gone. But you kept me alive with sheer will and stubbornness. I spent 47 years trying to find you, to thank you, to tell you that everything good in my life existed because of what you did that day. My marriage to Maria, my 4 children, my 30 years teaching high school history, coaching Little League, watching grandchildren grow up, all of it happened because you wouldn't let me die in that jungle. The doctors told me I had months, not years, when they found the cancer. I'm not afraid of dying, Bobby. I'm afraid of dying without you knowing that you're a hero. Not because some government gave you a medal, but because when it mattered most, you chose to carry someone else's burden as if it were your own. I carried a piece of that explosion in my shoulder for 54 years. My body turned it into a tumor, just like yours did. The doctors said it was rare, the way our bodies created protective shells around the metal fragments. Maybe we were both just too stubborn to let go of that day, too stubborn to stop protecting each other even when we were apart. I want you to know that the nightmares stopped for me about 10 years ago, not because I forgot what happened, but because I finally understood what it meant. We survived for a reason, Bobby. We lived to be examples of what brotherhood really means, of what it looks like when someone refuses to leave a friend behind. Your brother in arms, Michael Tex Rodriguez P.S. Maria has pictures of our life together. I hope seeing them helps you understand that your sacrifice wasn't wasted. Every birthday, every graduation, every Christmas morning with grandchildren climbing on my lap, you made all of it possible. Robert's hand shook as he finished the letter. 55 years of guilt and grief transforming into something else entirely. A profound gratitude for the life he'd been given, for the friend who'd never stopped believing in him, for the family surrounding him now. Maria reached into the satchel again, withdrawing a thick album of photographs. "Our wedding day," she said, opening to the first page. "Mike insisted on a military honor guard, said he wanted you to be there in spirit." Page after page revealed the life Tex had lived, teaching students, coaching baseball, holding babies, celebrating anniversaries. In every photo he wore the same expression Robert remembered from their youth, joy tempered by wisdom, hope seasoned with experience. He was happy, Robert said, wonder in his voice. He was complete, Maria corrected gently. And now, finally, so can you be. As the afternoon sun slanted through the hospital windows, casting warm light across decades of carefully preserved memories, Robert Mitchell finally understood the truth that had taken 55 years to reach him. Survival wasn't a burden to be carried in shame, but a gift to be received with gratitude. The mass was gone from his neck, but more importantly, the weight was gone from his soul. 6 months later, Robert Mitchell stood in his backyard on a crisp October morning, watching his granddaughter Sophia teach her younger cousin how to identify different types of leaves for a school project. The surgical scar on his neck had faded to a thin white line, barely visible unless someone knew to look for it. And for the first time in 3 decades, he wore a simple polo shirt without feeling the need to hide anything. The transformation had been more profound than anyone anticipated. Within weeks of the surgery, Robert's chronic pain had disappeared along with the mass. His sleep improved dramatically once he could lie flat again. His appetite returned, and with it 20 pounds of healthy weight that made him look years younger. But the most remarkable change was harder to quantify, a lightness in his bearing, a readiness to engage with life that his family hadn't seen since before Linda's death. "Grandpa, tell us about the war," 9-year-old Tommy had asked during Sunday dinner the previous week, with the casual directness that only children possess. Robert had looked around the table at his family. Jessica and her new boyfriend David, Sophia and her fiancé Marcus, Tommy and his older sister Emma, and realized he was ready to answer that question honestly for the first time in 55 years. "War is complicated," he'd said, choosing his words carefully. "It changes people. But sometimes, if you're lucky, it also shows you what really matters. Like the friends who won't leave you behind, even when everything seems hopeless." The conversations that followed had been healing in ways Robert hadn't expected. Talking about Vietnam, about Tex, about the guilt he'd carried and the friendship he'd mourned, had opened channels of communication with his family that had been closed for decades. Jessica finally understood why her father had been so distant during her childhood, why he'd struggled with intimacy even with Linda, why he'd seemed to be fighting invisible battles that no one else could see. "I wish I'd known," Jessica had said after one particularly emotional conversation. "I wish you'd trusted us enough to share some of that burden." "I was protecting you," Robert had replied. "Or at least I thought I was. Turns out I was just protecting myself from having to face it." The therapy sessions at the VA had been Dr. Williams' suggestion, something she recommended for all her patients who underwent complex procedures involving long-term embedded foreign objects. The body and mind are more connected than we often realize, she'd explained. Sometimes healing one requires addressing both. Robert had been skeptical at first. Men of his generation didn't typically embrace the concept of talking about their feelings with strangers. But the group sessions with other Vietnam veterans had provided a context he'd never experienced before. A room full of people who understood not just the facts of his experience, but the emotional weight of survival, the complexity of carrying trauma across decades, the challenge of integrating wartime experiences into civilian life. "You carried that metal in your body for 30 years, his therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, had observed during one session. Your body literally held on to the trauma, created a protective shell around it. Now that it's gone, you have to decide what to do with the space it left behind." The space, Robert had discovered, could be filled with things he'd forgotten he was capable of. Laughter that came easily, relationships that didn't require him to hide parts of himself, plans for a future that extended beyond mere survival. He'd started volunteering at the VA hospital, sharing his story with younger veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. The parallels were striking. Different wars, different technologies, but the same fundamental challenges of carrying invisible wounds, of feeling isolated by experiences that civilian loved ones couldn't fully understand. "The thing about trauma," he'd tell the groups, "is that it convinces you you're alone with it. Makes you believe that sharing it will damage the people you love most. But keeping it to yourself, that damages everyone, including yourself." The house felt different now, too. Robert had begun the process of sorting through Linda's belongings, not with the desperate avoidance he'd practiced for 3 years, but with the gentle reverence of someone honoring a life well lived. He'd found more letters, not just the ones she'd left for him, but correspondence with Tex spanning nearly 2 decades, a secret friendship maintained out of love and concern for the man they both cared about. Reading those letters had been both heartbreaking and healing. Linda and Tex had shared stories, photographs, updates about their respective families. They'd worried together about Robert's increasing isolation after Linda's diagnosis, had made plans for a reunion that Robert's stubborn pride had prevented. "She was trying to build you a bridge back to yourself," Maria Rodriguez had said during her second visit to Georgia, when she'd come to attend Robert's belated Purple Heart ceremony at the local VB post. "She knew you needed to forgive yourself before you could really live." The ceremony itself had been small but meaningful. Local veterans, family, a few of Robert's former construction workers who'd become more like sons over the years. As the medal was pinned to his chest, Robert had felt not pride in the traditional sense, but a deep gratitude for the recognition of something he'd spent decades believing was failure. "This isn't just about one day in 1969, the VB commander had said in his brief remarks. "This is about a lifetime of service to your country, your community, your family. Sometimes the wounds we carry aren't visible, but that doesn't make them any less real or any less worthy of honor." Now, watching Sophia laugh with her young cousin as they collected maple leaves in the morning sun, Robert felt something he'd almost forgotten existed: contentment. Not the desperate grasping after happiness that had characterized his middle years, not the numb resignation that had followed Linda's death, but the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally made peace with his own story. His phone buzzed with a text message from Jessica. "Dad, David and I are bringing lunch over. Tommy wants to hear more stories about you and Tex." Robert smiled, typing back, "Tell him to bring his notebook. I've got plenty of stories, and for the first time in 55 years, I'm ready to tell them." The morning air carried the scent of autumn leaves and the promise of cooler weather ahead. Robert Mitchell breathed it in deeply, his lungs expanding fully in a chest no longer constricted by the weight of secrets, his neck turning freely as he watched his granddaughter discover the simple joy of learning something new. The war was finally over. Not the one that had ended in Vietnam decades ago, but the one he'd been fighting with himself ever since. And for the first time since March 15, 1969, Robert Mitchell was completely, genuinely at peace, a message for our community. Sometimes the heaviest burdens we carry aren't visible to others, or even to ourselves. Robert's story reminds us that it's never too late to seek healing, to reconnect with family, or to finally share the stories we've kept locked away. Whether it's unprocessed grief, old wounds from military service, or simply the weight of feeling misunderstood, our bodies and hearts sometimes hold on to pain longer than we realize. The beautiful truth is that healing can happen at any age, and the courage to be vulnerable often opens doors we didn't even know existed. Your story matters, your service matters, and you deserve the same peace Robert finally found. What burden have you been carrying that might be ready to be shared? Have you ever discovered that a painful experience in your past had a different meaning than you originally believed? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.